When people think about the Old West, they usually picture dusty towns, honorable gunfights, brave sheriffs, and rugged independence. It is framed as a rough but romantic chapter in history, but that version leaves out a massive amount of truth. The real Old West was often lawless, brutal, deeply corrupt, and shockingly violent in ways that schools rarely discuss. In the late 1800s, one Western town discovered that public executions could be profitable. Not symbolic or quiet punishments, but large-scale hangings openly promoted as events. In places like Fort Smith, Arkansas, thousands of people traveled from surrounding states to watch prisoners meet their end. The gatherings became so popular that hotels filled days in advance, and vendors sold food and souvenirs to massive crowds. Entire families attended. Many of those put to death were Indigenous Americans or accused criminals who never received fair trials. Some were executed in groups, sometimes as many as 8 at once. Witnesses described cheering, laughter, and applause as the trapdoors opened. The events became so routine that local newspapers printed execution dates ahead of time. This was not viewed as extreme behavior at the time, it was normal. What schools rarely explain is that these executions were less about justice and more about intimidation and public spectacle. The goal was to send a warning to entire populations. Many of those hanged were convicted on weak or questionable evidence, but once the crowd gathered, the outcome was already decided. Justice came second to the show. One of the darkest truths about the Old West is that Indigenous Americans were sometimes displayed like animals for profit. In the late 1800s, traveling shows, fairs, and exhibitions featured Indigenous people taken from reservations and forced to reenact their daily lives for paying crowds. These were called ethnological exhibits, but they were essentially human zoos. Some individuals were coerced or outright kidnapped. Others were pressured through starvation or withheld resources. They were placed in staged villages and forced to perform rituals for entertainment. Crowds mocked them, touched them, and treated them as curiosities. These exhibits traveled across the United States and Europe. In some cases, individuals died from illness while being displayed. Their deaths were barely reported, and schools often mention westward expansion, but avoid explaining how dehumanization was used as a business model. These shows reinforced racist myths and justified violent policies. They were not fringe events. They were widely attended and socially accepted at the time. Medical care in the Old West was often experimental in the most literal sense. Frontier doctors regularly performed surgeries and procedures without patient consent. In some cases, patients were not even informed. Amputations, experimental substances, and untested treatments were common, especially among prisoners, Indigenous Americans, and the poor. Some doctors openly admitted they were using people to test theories. There were no oversight boards, no ethical standards, and no legal consequences. In mining towns, injured workers were sometimes subjected to procedures simply to see what would happen. Records show patients waking up mid-surgery without anesthesia, screaming while doctors continued anyway. If a patient died, it was written off as unavoidable. These practices were rarely questioned because frontier medicine was seen as necessary and brave. In reality, it was often reckless and cruel. Many medical advancements came at the cost of lives that were never acknowledged. The Old West loved the idea of the heroic sheriff, but the reality was far messier. Many lawmen actively worked with criminals while wearing a badge. In some towns, sheriffs were former outlaws who simply switched sides when it was convenient. Others accepted bribes to look the other way. There are documented cases of lawmen tipping off gangs before raids, helping them escape, or even joining in robberies. In exchange, they received money, protection, or political power. The lines between criminal and law enforcement were often non-existent. One town might label a man a hero, while the next called him a criminal. Schools often frame Western justice as simple good versus evil, but it was usually a web of corruption. If you were poor or powerless, the law rarely protected you. It kind of used you. Several Old West towns vanished not because they failed economically, but because of massacres so severe they were buried in silence. In some cases, settlers wiped out villages entirely. In others, rival groups slaughtered entire communities. Survivors fled, records disappeared, and the land was resettled. No markers, no memorials. Some of these sites were later built over with farms or railroads, and historians uncovered evidence decades later through oral history mysteries and forgotten documents. In many cases, the killings were ordered or supported by local authorities. The goal was to avoid retaliation or investigation. Schools often describe westward expansion as inevitable growth. They rarely explain that some towns exist today because others were violently removed from the map. Children in the Old West were not just helping out, they were placed in extremely unsafe conditions every day. Boys as young as 8 worked in mines, handling explosives and breathing hazardous dust for long hours. Accidents were common. Girls worked in saloons, boarding houses, and other adult environments where they were exposed to exploitation and unsafe conditions. Orphaned children were sometimes sold or contracted out as laborers to ranchers or businesses. There was no system in place to protect them. Schooling was rare and considered optional, and survival came first. This reality is often ignored because it clashes with the image of strong frontier families. In truth, childhood in the Old West was often brief and unforgiving. Executions in the Old West were not always quick. Some involved prolonged suffering. Lynch mobs regularly tormented victims before killing them. Beating, burning, and worse occurred in full view of crowds. In some cases, the accused had not even been charged with a crime. Rumors were just enough. These acts were justified as community justice. Participants believed they were protecting their town. The reality was mob violence driven by fear and prejudice. Newspapers sometimes praised these acts, others avoided details altogether. Schools tend to mention lynching in later periods, but often skip its deep roots in the frontier era. Women in the Old West faced risks that are rarely acknowledged. In rapidly growing boom towns, women were sometimes given substances in saloons and later vanished without explanation. Some were coerced into sex work or trapped in exploitative situations. Others were found deceased outside town limits or never even located at all. Local authorities frequently failed to investigate, especially if the woman was poor, unmarried, or new to town. Historical records show women arriving in frontier settlements and then simply disappearing from all documentation. No missing notices were posted, no follow-ups were made, their lives quietly faded from the record. The popular image of the fearless frontier woman often hides how isolated and vulnerable many women truly were in these environments. Railroad expansion was not just industrial progress. It involved organized violence. Railroad companies hired armed groups to intimidate, remove, or kill people living on desired land. Entire communities were forced out with little warning. In some cases, homes were burned to prevent return. These actions were often legal under manipulated laws. Resistance was met with force. The railroads became symbols of progress, but their paths were paved with fear and blood. Schools celebrate the Transcontinental Railroad without explaining what it cost the people already there. One of the most disturbing truths about the Old West is how much never made it into the official record at all. In many frontier towns, record keeping was inconsistent or intentionally avoided. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, there was often no coroner report, no trial, and no investigation. Some towns had no permanent law enforcement, while others deliberately failed to document incidents to avoid outside scrutiny. Deaths were written off as accidents or not recorded at all. Entire pages of town ledgers went missing. Historians later discovered gaps where years of events should have been. This meant countless cases of harm, disappearances, and unlawful killings were effectively erased. If no paperwork existed, it was as if the event never happened. Schools often rely on surviving records to teach history, but in the Old West, silence itself became a tool. What we are taught is only the portion that was written down, not the full reality of what people lived through. All right, guys, that's been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I will see you again soon. Bye.